Dun, 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 dun. Throughout Don Quixote, we have seen many different characters play their part in the way in which the story goes. In part 1 of the book, much of the adventure is focused around the actions of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. However, there is a shift in part 2 from part 1. In part 2, there is much more involvement of the characters that dictate how the story is played out. One of the most important characters is Samson Carrasco, and the important question to ask is, who is Samson Carrasco, and why is his presence in the book so important to the actions of Don Quixote? Who's Samson Carrasco? Samson Carrasco is introduced in the first chapter of the second part of Don Quixote. He had intrigued Don Quixote and Sancho Panza's interest when they had heard that he had read a book about them called The Imaginative Gentleman Don Quixote of La Mancha. The book describes the bachelor Samson. Now the bachelor, though his name was Samson, was no giant in stature, but was a very great wag. He was of swallow complexion, very sharp-witted, about 24 years of age, with a round face, a flat nose, and a large mouth, all signs of mischievous disposition. He would also be involved in Don Quixote's duels with the Knight of the Mirrors and the Knight of the White Moon. How was Samson Carrasco involved? It turns out, Samson was more than just a bachelor. He also fought Don Quixote in 2 battles, posing as 2 different knights. In his first fight, he fought Don Quixote as the Knight of the Mirrors. Why the Knight of the Mirrors? Before his duel with Don Quixote, he had put on armor that resembled that of mirrors. Over his armor, he wore a surcoat of cassock of some stuff with a quantity of little moons of glittering looking glass. Also, the name of the mirrors carries more significance than just the armor. Like a mirror would, the Knight of the Mirror resembled an image close to Don Quixote. He proclaimed his love for a single woman, and like Don Quixote, also had a squire. Although the Knight of the Mirrors lost, Samson would end up fighting Don Quixote later in the book. How did Samson do against Don Quixote in the later fight? Well, a similar situation happened with the Knight of the Mirrors. Samson, now the Knight of the White Moon, challenged Don Quixote. I have come to enter into combat with you, to own and confess that my mistress, whoever she may be, is incomparably beautiful than your Dulcinea del Toboso. However, the outcome would be different. He would end up defeating Don Quixote, and by doing so would end Don Quixote's ventures and send him back to his village. Now knowing who Samson was and what other characters he plays, what is his significance? Well, Samson was the character that helped influence Don Quixote to go on his sallies again in the start of the second part by telling him to go to the kingdom of Aragon and the city of Saragossa. Also, after losing as a Knight of the Mirrors, he was filled with revenge, and that fuel probably led to his actions as the Knight of the White Moon. And I quote, "But to imagine that I am going home until I have given Don Quixote a beating is an absurdity, and it is not my wish to make him recover his wits that will drive me to hunt him now, but a lust for revenge, for the aching of my ribs will not let me form a more charitable resolve." Also, like Samson helped encourage Don Quixote's allies in the second part of the book, he turned out being the end of them as well by defeating him as the Knight of the White Moon, sending Don Quixote back to his village, where he'd end up dying and the book ending. Samson Carrasco is a key character in the second part of Don Quixote. He was very involved in Don Quixote starting his sallies, became involved in some of the sallies along the way, and ultimately being the cause behind Don Quixote's end to knight errantry. Samson, although inviting in the beginning, fueled by revenge, ended up showing his signs of mischievous dispositions by disguising his character and influencing the actions that took place in the second part of Don Quixote. Ba-dum-bum-chum, da-dum-bum-chum, da-dum-bum, ba-dum-bum, ba-ding.